Thank you very much, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be with a group that's so interested in science and technology issues. As much as I enjoy the Hoover Institution, it's a little bit light on hard scientists. The only other besides me in residence is Edward Teller. I'd like to talk to you today about the Food and Drug Administration and also about regulation in general. FDA is really just a paradigm, a good example of what happens in federal regulation today. The costs of federal regulation are monumental. The General Accounting Office has estimated the annual direct and indirect costs at something like $647 billion annually. And other estimates by scholars are on either side of that estimate. So that's probably fairly accurate. Many Americans and their institutions have begun to wonder whether they get anything approaching their money's worth for that vast outlay. They have good reason to wonder, and FDA is a case in point. Now, the FDA is an agency that touches your lives inevitably every day in many ways. FDA regulates products accounting for 25 cents of every consumer dollar, more than $1 trillion worth of products annually. And FDA regulates everything from drugs and vaccines to X-ray equipment, other medical devices like diagnostic kits. It regulates microwave ovens, foods, food additives, animal drugs. Even regulates cosmetics. FDA's major enabling statute is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I'll be talking to you primarily about drugs, and I'll mention in passing medical devices today, but I won't be touching on any other FDA-regulated categories unless you ask specifically during the discussion period. FDA has raised the regulatory burden on drug companies by continually introducing new requirements and policies, regardless of their potential to hinder the delivery of new and innovative therapies to patients and others of us who need them. The drug development system in the U.S. has become the slowest and most expensive in the world. The total time required for drug development, from synthesis of a molecule through clinical testing and to eventual approval for marketing, has more than doubled from 6.5 to 14.8 years since 1964. Bringing a new drug to market in the United States now costs $500 million, $500 million per drug, by far the highest price tag in the world. The effects of these astronomical costs are pernicious. Concerns about costs and projected return on investment instead of what's best for patients now often drive drug development. The other effects are that fewer drugs are available, less money is spent on research and development, there's less investor interest in U.S. pharmaceutical companies than there would otherwise be, and more drug development flees offshore. These are some of the more obvious effects. There are some less obvious effects as well, one of which I'd like to mention in passing. There's an interesting phenomenon that economists call the income effect. And it's the deleterious effect of government regulation just because of the deprivation of income of individual consumers. And so the way the reasoning goes is that money that is spent on regulation, whether good, bad, or indifferent regulation, is unavailable to you, to other consumers, for other things. It's unavailable for better nutrition, for better shelter, for health care, and for other things. And that in itself exerts a deleterious effect. And it has even been roughly quantitated, and we find that the expenditure of roughly every $7 million accounts for one excess death. Death from usually from stress-related diseases, suicide, ulcers, hypertension, heart attack, stroke, and so on. So the point is that there's a wide spectrum of effects of these monies, these huge monies that are spent on regulation. whether it's good or bad. And as you'll see, I think, much of what FDA does is in need of reform. In fact, these days, few question that reforms are overdue for FDA, including, it would seem, the agency itself. Fearing legislative changes to the agency in this 104th Congress, FDA officials have undergone a kind of deathbed conversion to regulatory reformers, or so they would have us believe. To convince us of their newfound faith, they've announced a series of regulatory reforms, or what I refer to as regulatory miracles. Commissioner David Kessler and FDA's ample propaganda apparatus, that is, its public affairs office, regularly touts the agency's reforms. And they've adopted in recent months a fairly clever ploy. It goes something like, yes, we used to be sinners. We used to be fat and slow and inefficient. But now we've made internal reforms. And we're streamlined, we're getting products out more quickly, and so on. And so FDA's defenders in Congress and the media elsewhere say to those of us who criticize FDA, oh, you're criticizing the FDA of 1990 or the FDA of 1992. It's very different now. Now it really is reform. Contrary to the image that FDA has been trying to cultivate, in recent years the FDA has introduced numerous regulatory obstacles to drug manufacture and clinical testing of products. One of these impediments is an extraordinarily stringent rule on the reporting of drug side effects. Regulations proposed in October 1994 would require clinical researchers to report drug side effects more quickly and to presume that any time a patient gets sick or sicker during a clinical trial, the new drug is to blame. The drug would be, in effect, guilty until proven innocent. By requiring every industry researcher and FDA reviewer to have a lower threshold for stopping a clinical trial, that is, for being suspicious of the drug, the entire approval process will inevitably become even slower and more expensive than it is already. The comments on this proposed regulation submitted to FDA by academia and industry during the official comment period were instructive. The DuPont-Merck pharmaceutical company, for example, estimated that its reporting burden would double. Johns Hopkins University's Center for Clinical Trials actually performed a study comparing reporting of adverse reactions, that is, side effects, under the old regime to that of the new regime for a fairly large clinical trial. And they concluded that the FDA's proposed changes would have several effects. First, they would overwhelm with paper the institutional review boards, that is, these panels that are located within clinical research institutions that review all clinical trials. They would be utterly overwhelmed with paper. And FDA's proposed changes would increase the cost per patient and the paperwork generated per patient 62-fold and 63-fold respectively if these new rules were to take effect. The Johns Hopkins study also concluded that these markedly increased new costs would not be accompanied by any advantage, any benefit to patients. Another FDA impediment is its overly broad definition of what is called in the regulations promotional activities. FDA, since 1962, has had the authority to regulate labeling and therapeutic claims for a new drug. Promotion of an as yet unapproved drug of an approved product, that is an off-label use. I better explain that more clearly. When FDA grants a marketing approval, it specifies what the approved use is, and that's what can go on the label and into the company's advertising of the product. That's the on-label use. But often the approval that FDA grants is much narrower than the data most of us think the data would support. And in fact, as time goes on, the medical literature begins to reflect new possible uses, and those are off-label uses. But mentioning or promoting, as FDA would have it, promoting these off-label uses is absolutely prohibited, even if the peer-reviewed medical literature unequivocally supports the use for something new. So, for example, Taxol, an anti-cancer drug, was long approved and known to be effective in ovarian cancer. Oncologists knew from the medical literature that it was also useful in breast cancer, but any publicity of that or companies informing physicians that that was the case was prohibited. The FDA has interpreted promotion, that again, that's the term of art, the buzzword in the regulations, has interpreted promotion expansively to encompass any printed materials or advertisements, as well as a wide range of other activities. So companies have been prevented from distributing journal articles or textbook chapters to physicians to inform them about important but as yet unapproved new uses. A 1995 survey of clinical oncologists found that nearly 2/3 believe FDA has hurt their ability to give the best possible care to a patient on at least one occasion, and more than 1 in 10 believe that this has happened frequently. 3/4 of the oncologists oppose FDA restrictions on off-label information entirely, and 60% believe that these make their job more difficult. As part of their oversight of labeling and promotion, FDA has told companies that prior to product approval, they cannot do other things as well, such as convene focus groups to find out how to make packaging and labeling more user-friendly. Another example of an administration so-called reform is actually a new tax in the form of user fees on manufacturers of medical devices. Now, user fees are a particularly clever innovation by FDA because it gets away from the need for Congress to appropriate funds to keep FDA running and doing what it does. Instead of getting all its money from appropriated funds in the normal process, FDA sort of imposes a tax, a user fee, on drug companies or medical device companies. When they want a marketing approval, they have to write FDA a check for $100,000 or $200,000 or whatever it is. And so that's what then keeps FDA going. Well, for medical device firms, user fees are a particular problem. The firms are typically small and financially strapped, and even if the tax doesn't cause the companies to founder, certainly they'll have to pass the increased costs of regulation on to patients in the form of higher prices. And again, we get to the income effect that I spoke of earlier, the effects of depriving consumers in a systematic way of part of their income. Other administration pseudo-reforms that have dribbled out during the past 2 years, often with great fanfare, often actually accompanied by press conferences attended by the President, the Vice President, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Shalala, and the FDA Commissioner, have accomplished little. One in particular was FDA's November 1995 announcement of changes that would ostensibly modernize and streamline oversight of a class of products called biological drugs, or biologicals. Historically, these products, blood and blood products, vaccines, extracts of natural substances for treating allergies, that's the allergy shots that you get at the allergist, extracts of living cells, toxins and toxoids and so on, were treated differently by FDA from others. And there was some rationale for this historically. They were often rather impure and poorly characterized preparations. And so it was because it was difficult to demonstrate that each batch met carefully designed and rigid analytical chemistry standards for purity or potency, the FDA devised an alternative approach. They granted marketing approval both for the product itself and for the manufacturing facility. And the manufacturer had to demonstrate that the product would be produced in the same way with good and strict and rigorous manufacturing controls over each batch of the product. In addition, samples from each production batch had to be submitted to FDA for analysis. Now, non-biological drugs, other drugs for what you would usually think of as drugs for pain or for ulcers, high blood pressure, cancer, and so on, were traditionally smaller, simpler, chemically synthesized molecules that could be highly purified and characterized. In contrast to biological drugs, neither licensing of the manufacturing facility nor batch certification was required for these small molecule drugs. But advances in technology, particularly genetic engineering or recombinant DNA technology, have blurred the distinction between biological and other drugs. Many biologicals, particularly those made with recombinant DNA techniques, are now often highly purified, very well characterized preparations that can be regulated the same as other drugs. Biologicals manufacturing facilities continued to be certified in the old biologicals scheme of things, but in practice this is not very different from the inspections that are performed in the factories that make synthetic drugs. So in fact, there has not been, in recent years, very much difference. FDA's pseudo-reform, though, would henceforth cause certain biologicals defined as, quote, well-characterized biotechnology products, unquote, to be regulated as though they were non-biological drugs. For this subset of biotech products, the requirements for licensing of the manufacturing facility and for batch certification would be officially eliminated. As you'll appreciate, that's not such a big deal. Certainly not a deal that warrants an announcement by the President and the Vice President of the United States. As an indication, in fact, of how minimal any benefits from this change will be or could be, consider that there have only been about 20 biotechnology-derived biologicals approved by FDA during the past decade. Only one was approved in 1994 and none in 1995. I might say that just by way of biography, I was the reviewer for the earliest products of those, human insulin and human growth hormone, in the early 1980s. Consider also what was supposedly the most significant of the FDA reforms that have been proposed by the administration. And these were presented again with great fanfare last March, the very day after 3 FDA reform bills were introduced in the House. The highest officials in the land announced that henceforth FDA will permit the use of what are called surrogate endpoints, and I'll explain that in a moment, to speed up the entire process of cancer drug development. They said at the press conference, it is appropriate to utilize objective evidence of tumor shrinkage as a basis for approval, allowing additional evidence of increased survival or improved quality of life associated with that therapy to be demonstrated later. Now, when FDA, in its evaluation for marketing approval, requires a demonstration of safety and efficacy, and an appropriate balance between the two. FDA has traditionally wanted what they consider to be a meaningful and clear clinical endpoint: increased survival, decreased number of relapses, and so on. But occasionally you can't, or it's very difficult to obtain evidence for that kind of endpoint. And so you accept some sort of surrogate for that that distant endpoint. And in this case, FDA was suggesting that tumor shrinkage, instead of actual survival, lengthened survival, be an appropriate surrogate endpoint for anti-cancer drugs. Entirely reasonable? Absolutely. But FDA has long done this. They were just repackaging something old, something that was well established in medicine and at FDA, as something new for PR purposes. FDA has long had flexibility in the standards it uses for drug testing approval, including the use of these various surrogate endpoints for disease regression and prevention. So another good example of this is drugs that are used to lower cholesterol or lower blood pressure. We now consider those routinely to be valid clinical endpoints. If somebody develops a new drug for lowering blood pressure, we don't any longer require an actual demonstration that that drug prevents heart attacks or stroke. We consider it a given that if it lowers blood pressure consistently, that that's a beneficial effect because of the effect it'll have on heart attack, stroke, and ultimate survival. So the point is that treating the numbers, laboratory values alone, is and has been well established. In fact, in 1991, the FDA had adopted, at least in theory, a policy of using, quote, flexibility in the current statute to develop and adopt surrogate endpoints whenever possible to measure the efficacy of drugs used to treat life-threatening diseases, unquote. That was an FDA reform introduced during the Bush administration by his very conscientious Council on Competitiveness, headed by the Vice President, and that really dragged FDA kicking and screaming into adopting, or I should say announcing, certain reforms. That was 1991. The Clinton reform's most serious flaw, that in fact is likely to vitiate their impact entirely, is that they're to be implemented by FDA. Experience should have taught the futility of an agency being directed to reform itself. And in fact, the Council on Competitiveness reforms, FDA studied literally to death in the years after they were announced. I should also point out, partly for Reed Irvine's benefit, that FDA, this myth of FDA reforms, was bought completely by the media, by most of the major media. And in fact, editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post said, yes, we need FDA reform, but yes, they're undertaking it. And it's very important to retain the safety and the high standards of drugs and biologics and medical devices. FDA does that, and now that it's the new, improved FDA, it's really doing a terrific job. Let's hold off the extremists in Congress who want to emasculate FDA. Now, so I think an executive branch approach to this is doomed to failure. Congress could, however, at a stroke, achieve real reform, and the House Commerce Committee has provided a stunning example of legislation, of proposed legislation, that balances momentous social and economic issues, legal precedents, and the public interest. The Drugs and Biological Products Reform Act of 1996, H.R. 3199, addresses in several ingenious ways the ponderousness and length of drug testing and evaluation. Introduced originally by a bipartisan group of a dozen congressmen and boasting 180 co-sponsors as of about a week ago, it's vastly superior to the Senate bill introduced by lame duck Senator Nancy Kassebaum, and a huge improvement over the status quo. Not surprisingly, the House's approach to regulatory reform was anathema to FDA and to the administration. Commissioner FDA Commissioner David Kessler detailed FDA's opposition in a 9-page statement, called The Impact of the House FDA Reform Proposals, that's a masterpiece of misrepresentations and fear-mongering. In this document, Kessler claimed that, quote, FDA would be forced to approve new drugs using summaries of safety data prepared by drug companies, unquote. Simply untrue. The bill merely clarifies that rather than reviewing the voluminous raw data from clinical trials, often running to hundreds of thousands of pages and sometimes millions of pages, you've probably seen on TV the truckloads of documents arriving and being delivered by forklift. So instead of the charade of trying to go through these page by page, condensed, tabulated, or summarized data often would be adequate for review. Agency reviewers would have access to additional materials of any kind, but if and only if they were requested by agency supervisory officials. Kessler also cited the example of a drug called dilevolol, which he said was approved in Japan, Portugal, and England on the basis of data summaries and caused problems there, while Americans were spared because, quote, the FDA medical reviewer noted in the raw data evidence that some patients had severe liver injury, unquote. Another untruth. The record shows it was the company, Shearing Plow, that identified the toxicity and ultimately withdrew the application for U.S. approval. Kessler also claimed that the legislation would weaken the effectiveness standard for drugs and that FDA would be forced to approve a new use for the drug on the basis of, quote, anecdotal evidence of effectiveness and common use by physicians with no objective evidence, unquote. And he concluded that the result of that new lowered standard would be unnecessary pain and suffering patients would undergo until they were given an effective treatment. More untruths. That's just pure fear-mongering. The reality is that FDA's policies have made life progressively more dangerous for patients and more difficult for physicians. I mentioned earlier the problems FDA has created for oncologists with its policies on off-label uses and the proposed new requirements for reporting of side effects that would increase the paperwork and increase the costs substantially. The House bill's reforms would make it easier for health professionals to learn about new uses of drugs. As I mentioned earlier, companies have been prevented from distributing journal articles or textbook chapters to physicians and other health professionals to inform them about new, sometimes life-saving, off-label uses. They've prohibited them companies from sponsoring medical conferences. They've prohibited them from convening focus groups to make packaging and labeling more comprehensible, more user-friendly. By permitting the legitimate dissemination of information by textbooks and articles from peer-reviewed journals, H.R. 3199 would ease FDA censorship of scientific and medical information. Equally important, because it goes to the fundamental issue of how new uses are sanctioned for an already approved drug, the legislation would permit retrospective evidence from clinical research, that is, an examination of research results already performed, already published, to constitute the basis for approving additional uses. This is a sensible and much-needed alternative to expensive and time-consuming prospective studies, new studies. Overall, the House solutions to FDA overregulation are logical, carefully targeted, and most important, favorable to the patient's interest. H.R. 99, with 180 bipartisan sponsors, would get drugs to patients who need them faster and cheaper than FDA's current policies and procedures. Commissioner Kessler's analysis of the congressional proposals is fraudulent. No other word for it. If his analysis were an FDA-regulated product, it would be recalled. I should mention some of the other provisions of H.R. 3199. The bill emphasizes that the demonstration of efficacy of a new drug may be based on even a single well-controlled clinical trial if the statistical analysis and FDA reviewers support that conclusion. This change from the current requirement, this change moves us from the current requirement for clinical trials, plural, and removes ambiguity in the language of the existing statute. In addition, taking aim at the FDA's tendency to require, in all instances, double-blind trials. Double-blind, you'll recall, means that neither the patient nor the physician knows whether the patient is getting active drug or placebo. The bill also provides that clinical trial design should be, quote, appropriate to the intended use of the drug and the disease, unquote, leaving open other clinical design trials when it's felt to be appropriate and needed. The legislation would also create a more liberal efficacy standard for drugs intended to treat any serious or life-threatening condition. Like the current standard for AIDS drugs, which is more liberal largely because of the action of the pressure from AIDS activists, the new standard would be, quote, a reasonable likelihood that the drug will be effective in a significant number of patients and that the risk from the drug is no greater than the risk from the condition, unquote. Just common sense, I think most of you would agree. It's also humane because it would extend to patients with diseases like stroke, multiple sclerosis, heart failure, crippling arthritis, the benefits that are currently reserved only for patients with AIDS. The most significant changes wrought by the legislation turn over part of the evaluation of drugs from FDA to non-governmental entities. This elimination of FDA's regulatory monopoly has been recommended repeatedly by blue ribbon expert groups convened to improve and evaluate the drug approval system. The idea of privatization of regulatory activities, of course, is anathema to defenders of big government and FDA. But there's nothing at all sacrosanct about government's regulatory monopoly. The choice of a system of regulation that assures public safety is in fact not a binary one, either or, that is either government or private sector. The bill, in fact, would have established non-governmental alternatives to some, but only some, FDA oversight. Drug sponsors, that is the drug companies, if they wished, could have opted to have their products reviewed by non-governmental organizations, which could be private or public sector. Public sector would be universities, for example, and they could be profit-making or non-profit. These organizations, according to the bill, would be subject to FDA accreditation and auditing, and strict requirements backed by civil and criminal penalties would assure the confidentiality of data and the management of potential conflicts of interest. In any case, under this proposal, the sponsor could still choose to have FDA perform the review, and in all cases, the FDA would retain final sign-off for approvals, for marketing approval of products. This new mechanism closely resembles regulatory apparatuses already operating elsewhere and operating quite effectively. Medical device regulation in the European Union is currently performed solely by non-governmental entities, and many of you will be familiar with the way that underwriters' laboratories and similar groups certify the safety of electrical equipment in the United States. So there is no FDA equivalent for electrical equipment. These are non-governmental entities that do this for profit. The Drugs and Biological Products Reform Act was not perfect, however. It lacked any concrete provisions for what is called reciprocity. That is, some relationship, some linkage between marketing in the U.S. and approval by major regulatory agencies in foreign countries. That, of course, could hasten the approval of marketing of a product here if there were some linkage. This could be accomplished, for example, simply by giving the FDA a finite period of time, say 60 or 90 days, from the time of a British or a European Union approval to show cause why a product should not be approved, should not be marketed here. In the absence of such evidence from FDA, which would have the burden of proof, the drug would be approved automatically. Overall, however, the House Commerce Committee solutions to FDA reform were logical, carefully targeted, bipartisan, and most important, favoring the public interest. They would have gotten drugs to patients who need them faster and cheaper. FDA's intransigence and hollow reforms, or pseudo-reforms, argue the necessity of a change in the law, which the agency cannot simply ignore. Now, I'd like to take up another broader issue related to this, because it underlies needed changes in the FDA. And that issue is the ubiquitous question that's often posed to those of us who study government regulation. Why are regulators so regressive? Why are they so obstructive? As citizens, aren't FDA and EPA and other regulators eager to see new and useful products available to hospitals, physicians, and patients? Actually, no, because the regulators have other things, other weighty things on their minds. Regulators and other bureaucrats spend a lot of their time trying to stay out of trouble. And therein lies the nub of the problem. To understand this dilemma, we need to examine the way that agency officials perceive their own self-interest. One thing that in many of his writings, my Hoover colleague, economist Milton Friedman, reminds us is when you want to understand why something works the way it does, follow the self-interest. People will almost always act in their own self-interest, even if it disadvantages the rest of society. So when we're talking about regulators, especially those who carry out pre-marketing approval of products, as at FDA, at any cost, they attempt to avoid the approval of a harmful product, even as it makes the U.S. approval process the slowest and most expensive in the world, with many important therapies delayed or completely abandoned. FDA officials see no benefit to doing less, to streamlining regulation, to doing it more efficiently. Go slow means to them staying out of trouble. The regulatory apparatus's incentives and disincentives, risks and rewards, carrots and sticks, are therefore distorted. Now, I'd like to expand for a moment on this part of the issue, part of the why that FDA officials act as they do. There's a marked asymmetry or imbalance between the two kinds of errors, the two kinds of mistakes in decision making that a regulator can make. First, a harmful drug or other product is approved for marketing, what sometimes is called a type 1 error, or a beneficial drug or other product is delayed or rejected or never achieves approval, a type 2 error. Putting this another way, we're looking at the difference between regulators permitting something good to happen and they're not permitting, we're looking at the difference between regulators permitting something bad to happen and they're not permitting something good to happen. Several kinds of asymmetry are found in the two situations. Classic examples of type 1 errors are the approval of thalidomide in several European countries in the 1950s and the approval of swine flu vaccine by the FDA in, I guess it was the 1960s. These mistakes are highly visible. They elicit the wrath of the media, the public, and congressional oversight groups. And as a result, both the developers of the drug and the regulators who approved it are excoriated and punished. And modern day pillories include a segment on 60 Minutes, an editorial in the New York Times, or a command performance before a congressional oversight committee. Having done that, I can tell you it's no fun. So an FDA official's career might be damaged irreparably by the good faith but mistaken approval of a high-profile product that turns out to have a problem. Type 2 errors in the form of unreasonable demands or requirements can delay or prevent entirely the marketing of a new product. But a type 2 error caused by regulators' bad judgments, timidity, or anxiety is often known only to a few knowledgeable insiders. There may be no direct evidence that the continued suffering of patients because of the unavailability of a needed new product is avoidable, or that the regulators are culpable. Too often, non-experts, particularly the media, are satisfied with FDA's quote-unquote erring on the side of caution, even when that's merely a euphemism for committing a type 2 error. What we need then is to, arguing from first principles, what we need to do then is to alter the system of rewards and punishments, incentives and disincentives for government regulators to get at this basic asymmetry between type 1 and type 2 errors. Now, there are some carrots as part of the system that attempt to influence regulators' behavior positively, and these include performance plan goals and the like. But these are, as to use the British expression, weak as water. The clever regulator can always take refuge in the inadequacy or inconclusiveness of the existing data and demand yet another clinical trial, yet another animal study, yet another meeting of an FDA advisory panel. Delay, delay, delay. Consider, too, another kind of carrot that's offered to the regulator. The longer that product approvals take and the more functions that the agency has assigned to itself, the larger the number of FDA regulators needed. And that, in turn, requires larger budgets and larger bureaucratic empires, which are hardly a disincentive to FDA. So a regulatory agency's incentives and disincentives are distorted. The system of rewards and punishments actually encourages bureaucrats to think like a special interest, to do what's best for them rather than for what's best for patients, taxpayers, or, God forbid, American industry. However, negative reinforcement, appropriately applied, just as to a kid, can redress some of the existing asymmetry between type 1 and type 2 wrong decisions. One possible remedy that I've written about in several forums would be a kind of ombudsman panel that could evaluate agency actions and sanction those that deserve it. Cases could be submitted to the panel by drug companies, patient groups, or others. My experience from many years at FDA suggests that the number of appropriate issues or decisions for such a panel would be manageable, but there would be a real number of them. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing that I have in mind. In the 80s, there was a proven anti-cancer agent, a biotech product called alpha interferon, that had been approved for several other cancers already. And it was shown that it would shrink the Kaposi sarcoma lesions in patients with AIDS. And FDA decided that this shrinkage, actually often disappearance of these sarcomas, was not a meaningful clinical effect, that it was essentially cosmetic, and FDA wouldn't entertain an application for approval for shrinking these tumor lesions. Now, although subsequently that decision was reversed, that's an egregious decision in my view, and one for which FDA regulators should be held accountable. That's the kind of decision that could have been submitted to the ombudsman panel. Now, what should such an ombudsman panel look like? Well, I think it should have several characteristics. It needs to be organizationally located outside FDA in order that it be independent of FDA's top officials, including the FDA commissioner. And an appropriate location might be the Office of the Inspector General in the Department of Health and Human Services, where FDA is located, or in the Office of the Secretary in general. Second, the panel would obviously need to have access to a wide spectrum of medical and scientific expertise, and also regulatory expertise. And this could be accomplished either by having broad panel membership or by bringing in ad hoc experts as necessary. And last, the panel should have the ability to recommend disciplinary sanctions, ranging from censure to forfeited pay, bonuses, or even demotion, depending on the egregiousness and impact of the wrong decision. Therein lies the stick, and therein lies what's necessary. The Ombudsman panel then would be a partial remedy to FDA's lopsided bias against approving a harmful product, even at the expense of erecting huge economic barriers to product development and marketing. This mechanism, this Ombudsman mechanism, could be considered a model with application to other agencies as well. EPA, I would argue, is at least as much in need of such a mechanism as FDA. Well, in closing, my message is that a lot of change is needed in the FDA. And there are a number of conceivable routes to it, administrative and legislative, but the latter is much more likely to succeed. Unfortunately, it looks as though the legislative reform of FDA is not going to occur in this session of Congress. And we can get into a discussion, if you like, of why that occurred. It's essentially that FDA and the administration has put up barricades to meaningful reform. But I'm sure the bill will return, and it's good to know that this H.R. 3199 can serve as a model for FDA reform. Thank you very much.
My calculations suggest that there will be far fewer deaths if FDA were dissolved. Specifically, the delay, your type 2 error, of the approval of beta blockers, for example, when they've been proven very effective with high blood pressure in Europe for 10 years, took another 10 years in this country, during which time there was no decrease in mortality rate with the water bills, yet when these beta blockers were used here, the mortality rate was half. I calculated something between 2 and 10 million deaths during this 10-year period. What do you think of dissolving the FDA?
Well, I think that that a calculation such as you've done is extremely, extremely difficult because there are trade-offs in both directions. So, and it's difficult to know all of the what-ifs, let alone to quantify them. For example, if we didn't have an FDA and somebody introduced a vaccine that was administered to 5 or 10 million normal patients, normal subjects, that turned out to be contaminated with a slow virus, with something like the mad cow agent, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, we'd have a catastrophe of monumental proportions. So it's very hard to know. You have to say, well, if there's no FDA, what then? Again, Milton Friedman is very much a nihilist about government regulation. But he says that what would happen would be that market mechanisms would take up the slack, would provide an alternative, just as they do with Underwriters Labs, just as Consumer Reports evaluates household goods and provides you rankings of automobiles and refrigerators and air conditioners, that there would be a mechanism for that. and that there are lots of places that could come from. That HMOs, whatever we think about HMOs, the larger ones would want to know how cost-effective various new medicines were, and they would start to do some testing. So you have to know what you're comparing an existing FDA to. There are a number of proposals that could supplant FDA in a way that is cost-effective, and I would certainly agree with that.
Who were the sponsors in Congress and the Senate for H.R. 3199? And do you suggest that we contact our congresspersons in support of such a bill now, or wait until the next time it comes up?
There were I don't remember who the original dozen were. Some of them they came from the House Commerce Committee. So it was people like Tom Bliley of Virginia, Congressman Greenwood, Pennsylvania, and a number of others. I think Congresswoman Eshoo from my district. So there were a large number. We all have so many things on our plate. It's a nice offer. I think it's probably too late now to affect anything in this Congress. But I'd certainly urge you to keep your antennae attuned to it and to argue for a strong and unequivocal reform bill. The compromises that were being entertained, Ted Kennedy primarily leading those who would weaken the reform, were pretty monumental. And the Republicans took a lot of hits from the press and from the White House propaganda apparatus, claiming that they were soft on the environment, soft on consumer interests, and so on. And I think that's in part what made FDA reform impossible in the current climate. Anytime any of you would like to get reprints or additional information from me on FDA reform, feel free to write me at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, California, 94305, 6010, and I'd be glad to send you what current reprints I have on that or other subjects.
Lawrence Joyce, a pharmacist from Chicago. When I was in my last semester of the pharmacy program at the University of Arizona back in '77, my clinical instructor mentioned there was a new drug on the market, Vancero, which of course he said would be replacing prednisone and would have fewer side effects than prednisone. He said that the Vancero, which of course is not very commonly prescribed, had been marketed in Europe for 15 years already with fewer side effects than prednisone. If you want to talk to people about a real life street example, perfect example of something that should be approved, to have a European approval, that's something that a lot of people in your lay audiences would be able to relate to because it is so commonly prescribed. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, when I ran for Congress in the Illinois Congressional District, my proposal specifically was that if anything's been marketed for 5 years in a Western industrialized nation, that it should be marketed here. But secondly, what would you think, since some drug companies, especially the smaller ones, would have trouble marketing something, just getting public acceptance without, if there wasn't an FDA, because they don't have the reputation like, well, they can market it. What would you think of the possibility of making FDA approval voluntary, provided that people who do not submit to FDA approval conspicuously label their items not FDA approved?
Well, that's an entirely reasonable approach. There are a number. There's an entire spectrum from just improving FDA at the margins to abolishing it entirely and having the kind of mechanism that you suggest, making it voluntary and using labeling as a risk management technique to mitigate risk, or at least to enable consumers to shoulder more of the risk. So that's entirely reasonable. I especially like your proposal for reciprocity, for marketing approval in the U.S. based on a foreign approval. I think that's very important. Interestingly, the pharmaceutical and biotech industries have not backed reciprocity, fearing a backlash primarily.
Perhaps it could also make the overall approval process internationally more cost-effective if studies were being planned to meet approval multinationally rather than duplicate studies.
Some of that's being done. Unfortunately, when you harmonize internationally, what you usually end up with is the highest common denominator, the most stringent requirements everywhere. And the U.S. And its more stringent approach tend to dominate.
I'm Bob Chiak, physician in Washington State, and I'd like to ask Dr. Miller about other organizations that have active truth squads. For example, I got a call from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CDI, a year and a half ago, and we ended up picketing. David just heard a lecture in Seattle with placards that says, "Plunger power saves lives. Why does Tesla prohibit research?" alluding to the cardio pump. We had them stapled on the toilet plungers. And even the liberal Seattle paper called us a, quote, small group of protesters, quote. There were a total of 3 of us. And we got the simple message across that the pharmacist just mentioned. What about simply having the FDA put on a good housekeeping stamp of approval? And a straightforward example where the FDA is blocking things, where a simple procedure would solve a problem that can be capitalized in sound bites is one possible way to get this message across, and at the same time show how ridiculous current FDA procedures are. And as I'll leave the question to you, but at the lecture, we have one of the protesters was Robert Davis, who's written extensively and knows about this. But he asked Kessler that, and Kessler came up with a non-answer. Said, well, we're doing something about this. We're going to have a conference. And in this same audience, the Institute of Medicine, the president of the University of Washington, former dean of the School of Medicine, dean of the School of Public Health, the latter two having gone to the same medical school as I do, which puts me somewhat to shame. Immediately after this total non-answer, these poobahs stand up and award Kessler a certificate of appreciation, totally abandoning their brains and their intellects behind and not demanding that he answer the question. So what about some of these other
the basic issue there is one that I discuss with Milton Friedman occasionally, and I agree with him that in theory free market theories dictate that we get rid of an FDA and let market mechanisms provide an alternative. But we live in a real world. And that concern, that reservation, that qualification is the same thing that makes me have reservations about CEI's approach, because it creates a backlash. When you demonstrate for the abolition, the entire abolition of the FDA, it activates editorial boards all over the country. It gets average citizens who don't understand the nuances of FDA's threat, FDA's expense, FDA's burden, and the ripple effects from all that. It causes them great anxiety. And so I think while I respect CEI's ability to do that, to take that more activist approach, it's not one that I think is particularly constructive.